Picture this: a president posts a vulgar cartoon of himself. His top officials rush to defend it. Artillery gets fired over a highway full of civilians. And a convicted fraudster walks free while a dissenter faces prosecution. Sound like chaos? It's not. It's strategy. And if you don't understand the pattern, you are watching the wrong game. I've spent decades analyzing how systems collapse, not from external shocks, but from internal rot. And what we're witnessing isn't political theater gone wrong. It's the deliberate dismantling of accountability, dressed up as leadership. The scary part? Most people are too distracted by the spectacle to see the structure crumbling beneath it. So let me show you what's really happening. Because in investing, we have a rule: when style overtakes substance, trouble follows. The same holds true in governance. When a leader chooses to define himself not through service or policy, but through crude digital imagery, it reveals something crucial: authority is no longer built on trust, it's built on shock value. What we witnessed wasn't strategy. It was marketing gone wild. And in my experience, when the noise drowns out the fundamentals, a reckoning usually isn't far behind. That video wasn't random. It was calculated. It wasn't diplomacy or executive action. It was a caricature engineered to provoke, not enlighten. It wasn't comedy. It wasn't clever. It was a transmission of disdain, not just for adversaries, but for the very institutions that grant any leader credibility. In business, we call this a signal. And this signal was unmistakable: standards are obsolete. Outrage is currency. Allegiance, not law, drives the machine. What we saw was the mainstreaming of mockery. The implication that courts, legislatures, and citizens themselves are merely extras in a private production. That imagery wasn't just offensive, it was intentional. And the most troubling part? Watching accomplished figures, polished and articulate, scramble to justify it. In investing, we call that reputation damage. But in this environment, it's celebrated, not because it's truthful, but because it demonstrates who's willing to defend what shouldn't be defended. That's the genuine threat, when reasonable people choose compliance over character. In any structure, corporate or governmental, you measure its stability by how leaders respond when principles clash with ambition. Watching the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, face reporters to rationalize the irrational reminded me of an executive explaining a scandal as brilliant marketing. His calm demeanor isn't assurance, it's coercion. He's justifying what he knows can't be justified because the system now rewards submission over sincerity. In my field, when ethics become optional, insolvency is already underway. It just hasn't appeared in the books yet. The real communication isn't the action itself, it's the obedience it demands. It's a loyalty test. The objective isn't administration. It's supremacy. To demonstrate he can desecrate the position he occupies and still receive approval from those who understand better. That's not guidance. That's performance art designed to degrade. In corporate terms, it's when the executive torches the brand publicly and the directors applaud because they fear losing their seats. The directive to the inner circle is transparent: your future depends on your silence. It's not devotion earned through respect. It's devotion extracted through intimidation. And that's the costliest devotion there is. What we're observing isn't fortitude. It's surrender disguised as tactics. It's the conversion of public duty into theatrical compliance. The degradation isn't aimed at opponents. It's a trial for supporters. Every approval, every manufactured grin, every empty rationalization is an admission of moral bankruptcy. Meanwhile, those on the opposing side, analysts and critics, react with predictable indignation, protesting double standards as if equity were still the foundation of this arrangement. But that's like an investor complaining about principles in an enterprise that's already compromised its soul. The market of integrity has collapsed, and most participants haven't grasped it yet. Certain voices continue returning to the same complaint: imagine if the opposition had done this. But that perspective assumes balance still exists. It doesn't. This isn't a competition of values anymore. It's an exhibition of asymmetry, of what occurs when one faction weaponizes authority while the other still views it as stewardship. Protesting inequality while following the guidelines of a vanished system is like reviewing corporate policy while your partner liquidates assets behind you. The structure is already fractured, and some are still maintaining appearances. What they miss is that this isn't about hypocrisy. It's about abandonment. The previous standards weren't modified. They were eliminated. This is no longer about political paradox. It's about concentration. When the singular standard that counts is allegiance to one individual, the result isn't discourse, it's conformity. And once that establishes itself, institutions forfeit their autonomy. What endures is a mechanism of dominance, calculated, systematic, and unapologetic. And while some fixate on theatrics, the genuine transformation of authority continues quietly. In my profession, we separate distraction from signal. And this isn't distraction. It's the packaging of a deeper structural evolution. The inflammatory visuals are merely camouflage, designed to divert while the actual blueprint unfolds. It's not the provocation that matters most. It's what it conceals, the erosion of oversight, the centralization of force, and the acceptance of impunity. This isn't about poor judgment. It's about how frameworks disintegrate from within, through empty ceremonies and unchallenged dominance. That's the transgression. And what you're witnessing is its symbol, displayed without remorse. While public focus gets drawn toward meaningless spectacle, the genuine agenda advances silently beneath. We're observing the gutting of accountability through an allegiance-first philosophy. In this model of governance, outcomes aren't decided by misconduct, but by loyalty. A convicted individual whose background contains more invention than truth isn't penalized for dishonesty, he's elevated for obedience. Allegiance becomes the sole measurement that matters. And when that supplants competence or veracity, what emerges isn't governance. It's theater constructed on intimidation and favoritism. When someone can admit to years of financial violations yet serve minimal time, it indicates the framework is no longer measuring justice. It's negotiating loyalty agreements. This isn't mercy, it's patronage. Meanwhile, the same institution responsible for maintaining legal standards is deployed against a former official, not for fresh violations, but for dissenting. Whatever personal positions I might hold about that individual's policy history are beside the point here. The fundamental issue is weaponized enforcement. You cannot construct lasting institutions on selective application. The trust erosion compounds faster than any interest. 18 accusations resurrected from a previous administration's rejected file. This isn't prosecution. It's political messaging dressed in judicial robes. And the silence surrounding it speaks louder than the charges. What once was a neutral system of justice is now handled like private inventory, distributed to shield insiders, and forced to suppress disagreement. A society can endure corruption temporarily, but once law becomes an instrument of personal preference, the foundation crumbles. You no longer have a republic anchored in standards, you have a transaction, and the payment is silence. When legal benchmarks bend to accommodate the preferences of loyalty, the entire structure begins rotting from inside. Someone once central to a former administration now faces prosecution not for what he concealed, but for challenging the narrative. This isn't rule of law. It's a transactional system of compliance. We're watching justice transform from an impartial arbiter to a selective enforcer. What once was the baseline of democratic governance has become provisional, dependent on one's utility. And that's not merely bad for law. It's devastating for confidence, and courts, and agreements, and everything requiring predictable standards. Then there's the spectacle of those assigned to explain it all. Consider the speaker, someone who previously represented faith-driven guidance. His identity was moral lucidity. His attraction, spiritual dedication. But now that very image is being leveraged to sanitize the indefensible. He's not interpreting initiatives. He's rationalizing authority. He's been assigned the impossible task of defending performance as principle. Markets punish enterprises that market illusion as reality. Governance should operate similarly. But in this instance, illusion gets rewarded because it demonstrates submission, not service. What remains is a leadership structure forced into rhetorical acrobatics, stretching truth until it loses form. The speaker's justification isn't merely strained, it's vacant. He's not presenting concepts. He's filling silence with sanctioned noise. In business, when language disconnects from reality, we call it bubble speech. It precedes collapse. The same applies here. A republic cannot operate when its public servants become apologists for absurdity. It's not humility. It's not faith. It's the abandonment of duty wrapped in devotion's language. The same speaker who once positioned himself as a voice of morality now dismisses nationwide demonstrations as dangers to the nation. Peaceful assembly, protected by the Constitution, gets rebranded as disloyal behavior. It's a maneuver I've witnessed in business. When leadership can't tolerate examination, instead of addressing criticism, they label it sabotage. That's not governance. That's control masked as nationalism. When leaders reframe all dissent as disloyalty, you don't achieve unity. You achieve pressured silence. And in any framework, political or economic, forced silence signals internal deterioration. When disagreement becomes equivalent to betrayal, conversation ceases and something else starts. In finance, when investors stop questioning, bubbles develop. In democracy, when citizens stop challenging authority, authoritarianism advances unnoticed. We no longer have parties debating solutions. We have factions dividing the devoted from the condemned. And that transition, quiet but significant, replaces principles with loyalty examinations. The messaging isn't subtle now. It's calculated. Reward compliance, isolate skepticism, and make even a whisper of doubt feel treasonous. The charge of hating the nation becomes a flexible instrument used to brand anyone resisting conformity. That's not patriotism. That's coercion draped in symbolism. And beside that religious packaging stands the enforcement, the vice president. Someone who converted a troubled personal narrative into a platform of calculated anger. His path isn't unusual. We've witnessed this in corporate environments. An outsider elevated not for insight, but for channeling resentment. But governance demands more than narrative. It requires stewardship. And anger without discipline isn't leadership, it's instability in formal attire. He was positioned as the intellectual foundation of the movement, expected to transform raw emotion into strategic policy. But when theory is absent, action substitutes. And in this instance, the action wasn't thoughtful discourse or symbolic gesture. It was a live demonstration. Artillery rounds launched over a civilian highway. This wasn't national pride. It was an expensive exhibition of dominance, staged not for security but for provocation. You don't build confidence in leadership by firing skyward. You build it through restraint, not force. Picture it precisely. The second-ranking official orders military ordnance fired near unsuspecting citizens during their daily commute. This isn't defense. This is spectacle. A performance meant to impress, not protect. In business, we call this signaling. Except here, the message isn't strength, it's volatility. No executive earns lasting trust by terrifying their own workforce. And no government earns legitimacy by converting power into theater. That shell wasn't merely noise. It was a declaration, we can act without consequences. The people below that highway weren't adversaries. They were ordinary citizens, workers, parents, entrepreneurs. Yet in this narrative, they became props. Their safety was collateral in someone else's storyline. This isn't patriotism. It's projection. A distorted leadership form that mistakes dominance for credibility. In markets, when leaders forget their real stakeholders, collapse follows. In governance, the price is deeper, public fear, institutional fragility, and normalized recklessness at the summit. The genuine message being transmitted is this: we control the levers of authority, and we plan to use them without apology. But this degradation of institutional standards isn't confined to one political faction. The deeper tragedy lies in the quiet complicity of those who claim moral clarity while enabling dysfunction from the margins. It's not always the aggressors who carry the greatest long-term risk. It's the collaborators who wear the language of virtue while silently reinforcing systems that reward arrogance over accountability. In my experience, markets don't collapse from noise. They collapse from misplaced trust. Consider the case of a tech executive who built his reputation on purpose-driven leadership. He wrote essays. He gave speeches. He branded himself as the conscience of the corporate world. But when unrest touched his doorstep, not figuratively, but physically, his first instinct wasn't empathy or dialogue. It was to call for intervention. Federal force requested not for national emergency, but to preserve personal comfort. That's not stakeholder capitalism. That's selective conviction. And selective conviction isn't leadership. It's branding that folds under pressure. And when the illusion fades, what's left behind isn't contradiction. It's revelation. The same executive who championed justice in public is, behind closed doors, offering tools to the very agencies his public statements condemn. That's not oversight. That's opportunism. I've always believed that reputation is like capital. It takes years to build and minutes to lose. When a company monetizes both virtue and enforcement, it doesn't just confuse its mission. It fractures trust with every constituency it claims to serve. Once that trust breaks, no quarterly report can fix it. A public figure who built his image on compassion and equality now offers back-end tools to agencies tasked with large-scale removals. That's not corporate responsibility. That's strategic inconsistency. In my world, when a company presents one story to the public and another to procurement officers, it's not a brand, it's a mask. And when the mask drops, what you find isn't policy failure, it's ethical vacancy. These aren't two opposing leaders. They're reflections of the same framework. A system where influence matters more than intention, and where the bottom line always overrides the mission statement. One cloaks authority in Scripture. The other wraps profit in the language of justice. But the destination is the same, unchecked control masked as service. In investment, we call this a misalignment of incentives. Leaders publicly committed to one vision but privately operating under another aren't misunderstood. They're misdirecting. That's why this moment isn't about left or right. It's about the corrosion of principle by ambition. When public office becomes theater and corporate ethics become contingent, the institutions that hold a society together begin to unwind, quietly, then quickly. What once claimed to be a movement of ideas has now surrendered to personality. Thoughtful policy has given way to reaction. Strategy replaced by spectacle. This isn't a realignment. It's a retreat from substance into sensation. No framework, no agenda, just manufactured outrage dressed as ideology. And like all systems driven by emotion over reasoning, it's fragile. What you lose isn't just discourse. You lose trust. And in any enterprise, public or private, when trust exits the room, collapse rarely lags far behind. This isn't just about an outrageous video. It's about what fills the vacuum when principles are withdrawn. When a political movement abandons policy for provocation, what remains isn't ideology. It's impulse. The result isn't debate. It's distraction dressed as leadership. And when institutional credibility is traded for emotional spectacle, we shouldn't be surprised when public trust collapses. Having a national figure spend their platform rationalizing crude theatrics isn't governance. It's misallocation of influence. And influence, once squandered, rarely returns. You then arrive at a moment where symbolic leadership turns literal. A vice president chooses to demonstrate patriotism not with clarity or courage, but with live artillery. That decision wasn't policy. It was theater with consequences. In investing, we avoid assets that spike on noise but collapse under scrutiny. The same principle applies here. A public act meant to project strength revealed instead a void of strategy. National unity isn't built on fear. It's built on trust. And that trust is shattered the moment government treats its citizens like set pieces for political choreography. What we saw wasn't patriotism. It was its shadow, a calculated display engineered to provoke rather than protect. Performative leadership may generate headlines, but it erodes the underlying structure of governance. The same working-class Americans so often invoked as symbols of pride were, in this moment, treated as liabilities, expendable, invisible, voiceless. In business, we call that reputational debt. The moment when brand diverges so far from behavior that stakeholders begin to walk away. And when the public does that to its institutions, the loss isn't just political, it's generational. What we witnessed wasn't governance. It was spectacle over stewardship. A government doesn't earn legitimacy by showcasing raw force. It earns it by protecting people, consistently, quietly, predictably. But here, state power was wielded like a performance tool, not a public duty. It's the institutional equivalent of flexing muscle during a shareholder call, intimidation instead of reassurance. When citizens feel like an audience rather than participants, something has shifted. Not just the narrative, but the foundation. And that foundation is law. Or at least it used to be. In systems built on loyalty rather than principle, the most effective currency isn't merit, it's allegiance. That's why the clemency granted to a convicted fraud wasn't just a legal move. It was symbolic, a signal that loyalty to leadership now outweighs violations of truth, process, or public trust. When a public figure, exposed and admitted to deception, walks free, not because the facts changed, but because his allegiance held, that's not clemency. It's calibration. A recalibration of the justice system to reward those who play by internal rules, not the nation's. In that same breath, another figure, one with a long controversial legacy in foreign affairs, is prosecuted, not for new actions, but for stepping outside the echo chamber. What we see here is the reshaping of consequence. In investing, we call this survivorship bias, focusing only on those who remain inside the circle, ignoring the risk to those who spoke out. When disloyalty becomes the only punishable offense, you no longer have a system governed by law. You have a culture of selective enforcement, where the legal machinery responds not to evidence but to political temperature. The official charge may be procedural, 18 counts related to document retention, but the underlying message is unmistakable. His real offense wasn't mishandling records. It was breaking narrative discipline. He wrote a book. He voiced dissent. And in a system where conformity is currency, that's enough. This is no longer about legal thresholds. It's about perceived betrayal. In business, we call this reputational retaliation, punishing transparency because it disrupts the storyline. When punishment flows not from law but from deviation, you are no longer operating under constitutional principle. You're managing loyalty portfolios. In such a climate, the mechanics of justice shift. Agencies that once embodied institutional independence begin to resemble subsidiaries, tasked not with upholding law, but with reinforcing allegiance. The courts, the FBI, the Department of Justice, they risk losing their identity as public guardians and becoming instruments of internal politics. This is what happens when checks and balances are repurposed for strategic advantage. In my world, we call this institutional arbitrage. It's when rules are selectively applied to engineer outcomes rather than ensure fairness. And the cost is enormous, not just legally, but in public trust, which compounds negatively over time. The symbolic imagery often draws the headlines, but it's merely a projection of a deeper structural erosion. That display wasn't random. It was a branding effort, distilled contempt for systems once meant to serve everyone. And while some voices on the opposition side still wring their hands over etiquette, the fundamentals are quietly collapsing. This isn't a debate over norms. It's a shift in architecture. A republic doesn't collapse in a single vote or speech. It deteriorates when serious people treat sustained degradation as procedural noise. And when that happens, the markets of belief, our shared sense of legitimacy, begin to break. There's a certain kind of opposition that still clings to tradition like it's a firewall against collapse. They write letters. They cite norms. They attend hearings with the belief that institutional process alone can restore equilibrium. But in markets and in democracies, faith in rules without enforcement is wishful thinking. If your playbook is built for a game that no longer exists, you're not defending principle. You're maintaining ritual. And ritual without relevance becomes parody. What they're practicing isn't strategy. It's nostalgia disguised as resistance. What they refuse to acknowledge is that the architecture has shifted. This isn't about bending rules. It's about rewriting them in real time. When loyalty becomes a get-out-of-jail card and dissent triggers prosecution, the message isn't confusion. It's clarity. A new framework is being installed, where justice is discretionary and punishment is personal. In finance, we call that asymmetric risk. Heads they win, tails you pay. And when a system rewards allegiance over conduct, it no longer allocates justice. It distributes power. In this restructured model, the moral ledger flips. Character is discounted. Performance is measured in shamelessness per unit of influence. The more you defend the indefensible, the higher your stock rises in the new order. That's why we see officials willingly contorting themselves to justify the unjustifiable, not because they believe it, but because survival now demands a demonstration of submission. This isn't about persuasion. It's about signaling. And the signal is clear: if you're willing to degrade yourself publicly, you're safe privately. When public figures, whether in office or in business, treat power as a performance rather than a responsibility, they reveal something fundamental, not about policy, but about values. Launching military displays over civilians or toggling between progressive speeches and behind-the-scenes deals isn't just tone-deaf, it's intentional. In my experience, the clearest indicator of long-term risk isn't financial leverage, it's moral detachment. When contempt for the public becomes a qualification for power, you're not looking at leadership. You're witnessing a reshuffling of loyalty metrics. In this model, values become temporary costumes. They're worn when they align with influence and discarded the moment they don't. We've seen this in business, when companies champion ethics in press releases but quietly lobby for the opposite behind closed doors. The same pattern now defines large parts of our civic and political class. Nationalists wrapped in slogans, executives draped in purpose statements, but underneath, many operate on the same calculus: what protects proximity to power? What shields revenue? In that equation, the public becomes optional. And so we arrive at the inevitable convergence. Politicians, CEOs, pundits, all orbiting a center of gravity defined not by law or principle, but by spectacle. The shouting matches, the symbolic gestures, the selective mercy, the public prosecutions, they aren't isolated. They're strategic, designed to overwhelm, not to inform. In markets, when too many signals contradict underlying fundamentals, the result is confusion. In governance, it becomes exhaustion. And when exhaustion sets in, people disengage. That's when the real restructuring happens, quietly, beneath the noise. What appears to be chaos is, in fact, coordination. The endless distractions, the provocations, the staged crises, they serve one function: fatigue. Not physical, but cognitive. It's the slow erosion of public stamina. In investing, we know that once emotion replaces analysis, poor decisions follow. The same holds true in democracy. When citizens grow numb from constant disruption, they disengage. That's not dysfunction. That's design. It's the precondition for re-engineering governance without resistance, quietly, while everyone else is too tired to notice. The goal isn't confusion, it's resignation. The steady drumbeat of irrationality creates a psychological environment where logic feels irrelevant and principle seems obsolete. When systems behave unpredictably long enough, people stop expecting coherence. In markets, we call this volatility fatigue. In politics, it becomes a strategy, normalizing the absurd until people adapt to dysfunction. And once adaptation sets in, manipulation no longer requires force. It thrives on lowered expectations. Symbols lose meaning. Institutions become hollow. And governance becomes a spectacle masked as authority. At the core of this model lies contempt, not hidden, but broadcast. Not denied, but institutionalized. When a government uses public trust as a prop for self-glorification, it reveals its true design. Citizens are no longer participants. They're spectators to their own displacement. In finance, when a company treats its shareholders as expendable, collapse is only a matter of time. In democracy, when leadership reduces the people, the law, and the flag to instruments of self-worship, the crisis isn't coming. It's already here. This isn't the moment for nuanced parsing or sympathetic interpretation. When actions openly dismantle trust and treat constitutional norms as theater props, the responsible response isn't dialogue, it's clarity. In finance, when an enterprise openly defrauds shareholders, we don't call it disruption, we call it collapse. And what we're witnessing here is a similar collapse of civic ethics, of legal standards, of public dignity. The first duty of any rational participant isn't to empathize with chaos. It's to name it unflinchingly for what it is, a deliberate act of national self-destruction. When reason is discarded in favor of rage, institutions don't just decay, they invert. What was once a platform for deliberation becomes a stage for performance. Governance is no longer a tool for solving problems. It's a sandbox for emotional release. We've seen this in markets before, when bubbles are built on belief instead of fundamentals. Eventually, they burst. The difference here is human cost. And our responsibility isn't just analytical, it's moral. In times like these, neutrality becomes complicity. The refusal to join the spectacle is the only resistance that matters. This is where we are. A surface polished in flags and slogans, masking a core built on resentment and bravado. The show is no longer symbolic. It's operational. The display of dysfunction isn't accidental. It's part of the brand. And the damage isn't theoretical. It shows up in weakened institutions, in normalized cruelty, and in a generation learning that public service is a stage, not a responsibility. In capital markets, such branding would be priced in. In governance, the cost accrues in silence until the system defaults on its social contract. And when that happens, the pretense disappears entirely. What remains is power stripped of persuasion. It no longer asks for permission. It no longer fears exposure. It smiles without shame and demands applause, not because it deserves it, but because it knows many are too tired, too distracted, or too afraid to say no.